Good evening, BookTube. This is ML Clark, and I am quite relieved to finally be starting the work for this BookTube, this channel in general. I had sorely hoped to start it in January, but life got in the way, as folks will know if they have been following my newsletter, mlclark.substack.com. And if you haven't, the short version is that my year was very quickly derailed by the needs of a family in crisis here. So over the last month, there was a lot of scramble and a lot of emotional support for a single dad of two children who had been thrown to the street in December, one of them very sick with pneumonia, and unfortunately, because the family didn't have health insurance, there really weren't that many options for the 4-year-old, and it was a lot. There were 3 surgeries involved, 3 courses of stem cell treatment. He's still recovering at home on oxygen for another month. We tried to get his dad stable with a job and security on his home front. We did. Me here, but with a lot of help from folks who listened, read, and supported. So first and foremost, thank all of you for helping me get through that crisis. It's not quite over yet. The dad unfortunately had appendicitis, so he had to leave the work that we just got him started while he's recovering. The kids still aren't fully affiliated, so there are still stressors in the background. But I am so relieved to be able to get back to the work on hand, my work, the work of getting this press launched and trying to share my pieces with the world. And I guess also to start a real conversation, which is also why I wanted to give this whole format another go. I don't really like video in general, but I do know that it is important to connect in as many ways possible, especially because I'm fairly isolated. I don't have many resources available to me. I am now an indie published author, and I am leaning into that as much as I can. But there is a steep learning curve, and we're going to talk about that steep learning curve in other episodes when I touch base with respect to the campaigns that worked and the campaigns that I highly recommend avoiding. The costs of indie publishing are tremendous, but one of the other facets just it's lonely. It's a very lonely way to go about trying to get any work into others' hands. And at the same time, our industry, well, let's put up this first beautiful banner right here. I don't know if for anyone who's just listening, you won't see it, but it says RealTalk. This is not an easy process, and yet our industry is not doing well because the world is not doing well. And one of the other reasons that I find it sometimes very difficult to get back to the work for the press for my writing is because I find it very difficult to balance moving through the real world with all of its major crises and then moving through the world of literature, which has its own tempests and teapots and its anxieties and its metrics of success. Oh, did your story get on a list this year? Did your story get nominated for a prize? Have you sold enough units to appease your publishers enough that you'll get a second chance? All of these are stressors that belong to the world of publishing, and they are important within the discipline. And yet, we're coming up on the end of the first year of Russia's invasion in Ukraine. The sheer number of people who have been displaced and the way that their displacement was absorbed by the world, in contrast to the way the world has responded to other displacement pressures and the profound xenophobia and racism that emerged around that discourse. Quite painful, obviously, for the world. We're still living with COVID-19. And we also have to be very careful because now that we are acutely aware of how fragile our species is, we should be doing more to sort of cut bird flu off at the pass before it can create another zoonotic event. These are real issues, real crises. And even this past month, helping a very poor family, I'm surrounded by poor families here. And when I go to the store, I am passing many families with children out in the street begging. It's a different world. Even coming back today from recording podcasts at an office in town, I passed a tremendous number of people who spend their entire days, all of their creative capacity put to one side, finding enough to eat, scrambling through the trash. It is it is a different world that we walk through. So it's difficult sometimes to be a writer credulously engaged in the work of literary promotion, self-promotion, telling folks, oh, you have to buy this book or you have to support my work, when truly there is so much need in this world. And what we really need to do is just to connect with one another, which for me is the reason I write in the first place. Not to get on lists, it's not to be promoted for awards. The superficialities that I say superficialities, I don't mean to knock somebody else's value in them. But those particular metrics of success were very much based on popularity within certain contexts that often tend to be fairly affluent, fairly privileged. And I just want to live in a world where everyone is able to do the creative work that they want to do and to explore that part of themselves. And I see around me so many people who probably could be better writers, better creators in many ways, having to spend all their time on the street with a bag of candy, begging for coins so that they and their children might have somewhere to sleep and enough to eat. It's just not fair. So it's difficult for me. It's my long way of saying that getting back to this work is important within the context that I live in, and yet I do not ever want to be trapped in that bubble and think that this is the be all and end all. It's easy to do so for many reasons. When I started moving back to my promo work this week, I immediately tripped into a level of guilt and self-loathing, quite honestly, because part of me thought, well, if only I were better at this whole literary game, if only I had been able to sell a book to a publisher and maybe something that would have gotten more accolades, if only I'd been able to play the game better to get more money, I'd have more means to help people around me with the basics of living. And so I felt like a really shitty human being because I can't seem to manage to be enough of a success in any of my industries to be able to improve my agency and the way I move through the world. I do the best I can with what I have, but boy howdy, sometimes it surprises you the level of self-loathing that can come out when you realize you can't play any game well enough to do the work that you really want to do. So it goes. And that's part of the reason I wrote the book. Oh, I have to do it the other way, the mirror there. There we go. That you can see over here, then raise the dead man high. Because it is about the way that we ourselves, oh, you know what, I'm also going to change, this is really cool that I can do these little switches like that. Switching over for anyone who can't see the screen to another banner that says BookTalk, because now we're getting into the book. Do you like my transition? I'm working on my transition. So again, I've been talking about this book for a while in many contexts, precisely because I set a really high standard for myself. I wanted to talk about humanism. I wanted to advance a very humanist philosophy, but I didn't want to cut corners. I wanted to place the challenge of humanism in one of the most difficult periods in history. And that's what this one is set in. It is in a very difficult period of history, 1920s through 1940 Soviet Union for the main text. There's also a coda, a little extra chapter that takes place in the 1950s. But the framework for this book was a time when one was truly living within a state of total oppression. And if you have read any of the literature that came out of that period by writers who survived that period and later wrote about it, what was especially striking to me is the way that the state around us cultivated internal prisons of the mind and internal castigation for not doing more, for not doing things correctly. And that's something that resonates, I think, with a lot of us in many circumstances. I certainly live within a prison of my own mind a lot, partially because of bipolar. Very frustrating. I go into down cycles, and in those down cycles, the kind of counterproductive thinking that I work through is habituated from a body of experiences that are outside of my control and quite nasty. I'm quite hard on myself. That's something that I grew up with. And so that is something that I always have to work through in order to find the energy, the space, the clarity of thought to be able to move in the world and to enact agency in the world. This is the way I've written quite a bit of my fiction, and it's also, I think, part of the reason that my fiction has not been as popular. And again, when I use that word popular, popularly just doesn't matter, but I'm trying to explain that I don't think it found as much of a purchase as a lot of other work because my characters very rarely have as much agency as other people's characters. I read other work and I think, how did your character just do the thing? Instead of working through whether they had the right to do the thing, castigating themselves all along the way. The prisons we live within are quite difficult and they can consume quite a bit of our energy. So this particular book allowed me to imagine three characters who are connected characters. One thing I've noticed already while reading some of the reviews that I have received from the work is not everybody realizes that the three components in this story are connected. You have three characters at the beginning. You really only meet two of them because you have Valentina and Arseny, but Arseny's girlfriend, Raisa, is very important. She grows up to be Barak in the third section. Arseny is an engineering student in the first section of Valentina, who's also an engineering student, different forms, but same institute. He ends up getting recruited by the NKVD, and so he ends up in the secret police, and it leads to quite a journey. So you have the first section, idealism of youth in the 1920s, that magical period where Leninist ideals are still very much in the fore of many people's minds. They think, yes, these are difficult years, but we are moving towards the creation of a fully communist state. And then the 1930s come along, and we join Arseny as a member of the secret police during the Great Purge, and the Purge is horrific in so many ways. There are just compounding traumas all across that region as the Soviet Union very clearly committed horrific acts of genocide, targeted genocide, as well as trying to clear its own ranks of any possible saboteurs, anyone inside the government that Stalin thought might not be loyal. Awful, horrific period. And the worst part about those kinds of histories is that they truly wipe so much from our record. So much is destroyed. And then the third component follows Raisa Nawarak in a gulag scenario, and she is hardened by well-earned cynicism. I won't spoil why. And she sees everyone around her in a way that she's quite hostile to the idea of any kind of tenderness in the world now, even while she is trying to do something that she feels she has to do. She has been hurt too many times, and so she hurts herself too in that section. A lot of the women in Gulag hurt each other as they hurt themselves. It's a very painful book, and as a result, I did not expect it to be glowingly happily read by many, but it was very important to me. So that's why I wanted to be able to talk a little bit about the book and also to do a little reading from it. But yeah, let's switch over a little bit to do oh, you know what? No, let's do the reading first. I'm actually just going to read from the first component. Because I want to talk a little bit about the feedback. It's funny, as I got back into promotion this week, I saw my first negative review of this book. And I was perfectly fine with negative reviews. I thought to myself, this because it's a bleak book. Of course, people are going to think it's absolutely terrible for many reasons related to that. But the first negative review was related to something else, and it was a gut punch because it's one topic that always makes me a little bit sensitive. And that's okay. I got through it. But oh, hard hit. I, as you might know already, am not Russian. I'm writing a book that's set in the Soviet Union. It's actually set in Russia and Belarusia in two different parts. But the hard part is that I am acutely aware of how terrible a lot of other white writers have been in the past when writing other contexts and receiving criticism about writing other contexts. I strongly believe everyone can write whatever they want. That's fine, but it does not entitle you to a pass from criticism. So you're going to get critiques sometimes if you do things wrong, if you get things wrong, and you have to be open to that. I strongly believe that. The problem is that the two times that I have received critique on cultural grounds for the work, they've never been accurate critiques. And so that sometimes it gets very complicated. I'll give you the other example. The first time that I published a story that was set in Colombia, I wrote a piece set in this region, Antioquia, and it was set in a future, near future, where climate change had worsened. And so the city of eternal spring had become the city of eternal summer. And in this story, I have a Colombian who's very much haunted by sort of his own personal past, and the kind of person he's been in the past, and a woman who was originally displaced from Venezuela, because Venezuelans are now about 4% of the population, so it makes perfect sense that in the future there's going to be a lot more integration. These two are sort of loosely citizen scientists who have come up with a solution to try to fortify the mountains from landslide, one of the biggest dangers from climate change for this region going forward. Earthquakes to some extent should also be kept in mind. And there's a volcano in this country, but when it comes to climate change, it is the number one concern. And UN reports say that something like 500,000 homes are in peril in the coming years from climate change's impact on the region. So I figured I'm going to write a story that involves locals tackling that problem. And in that story, I have a character. Well, the Colombian character has to at one point go around and try to get permission to work on a piece of land that is owned by an indigenous person. And that one also, I was following some of the roots of how the Imbara peoples will be moving and might be moving in the future as well. There is a significant population here already. You have quite a few indigenous people begging on the streets, but also quite a few who live integrated in many of the poorer barrios in the city. So you'll have these terrific cultural mixes, and most people here will say todos somos mestizos, we're all mixed. And so you do have lots of Venezuelans who've been displaced here. You have indigenous folk. You have a lot of Colombians that can maybe still trace very strong ancestry to Spain, and they all live more or less integrated within the city, but there are some stratifications. So this leads to the critique. So I published this story and I shared it with two Colombian writers that I was becoming acquainted with here. And they almost immediately, when they read it, they wrote back to say this might work for North Americans, but this is not a good piece for Colombians. And I was gutted. What? And so I felt ashamed. I felt immediately that I'd failed. And I asked, can we hop on a call? Can you tell me what your feedback was? And in that call, I thanked them. I said, I apologize for putting you in the position where you have to explain this. I really thought that I had been careful. And then they gave me their criticisms, and they were all the most pedantic, malevolent readings of the text, reading for error in ways that created error that didn't exist. For instance, they claimed that it was inappropriate to say that Medellin was so hot when I specifically was writing about a future where the city of eternal spring becomes the city of eternal summer because of climate change. It's right there on page 1. They were upset that I had a character in a poncho. I said, oh, you think that all Colombians are in ponchos? Like, no, it's a rain poncho. It's a very specific unit of clothing. And that might have been like a cultural trigger in the sense that in English we use it a little bit more innocuously. But the key part, the really key part, and unfortunately the reason we've never really talked ever since, because it was a very complicated and surprising conversation, was they were upset that I had a paisa is the word for a person in Medellin talking to an indigenous person. They said they wouldn't do that. A paisa wouldn't talk to an indigenous person. And I was so shocked. I was like, that's not even close to true. I've been in tons of barrios here where everyone lives together. And what is true is that there is still class strata here. And so what came out of that conversation was finding out that these two don't talk to indigenous folks. And they even have a little bit of resentment because there are government grants for writers and creative folk that are tied to having, I think it's about 15% representation of indigenous content. And so there's a whole body of prejudice. Every society has it, and that was the core of some of the complaints. But it was such a complicated process because here I was acutely aware, oh my goodness, I don't want to do this. I don't want to get this wrong. I want to make sure that I represent the culture properly. But it was an important lesson as a writer is, again, no culture is a hive mind. And sometimes you're going to trip over very different prejudice points of view that certainly can exist in another culture, might not necessarily be appropriate to take into account. So it's always been interesting because I care very much about getting culture right. But one of the parts of getting culture right has had to be learning when someone's cultural critique is not correct. And that's what happened yesterday when I got my first cultural critique from someone who identified themselves as of Russian ancestry. And they were at first they, again, I'm so open to criticism that at first I was like, oh my goodness, did I miss something else with the language? Because they'd said there's something very wrong with the language. After I thought about it, I realized, oh, no, 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 no. They're just calling attention to the fact that I made a choice with the naming traditions. And if anybody is familiar here with Russian naming traditions, they are quite particular. They're strongly varying based on context. And they're difficult sometimes to translate into English, which is why many folks, when they're translating works by Tolstoy or Dostoevsky, they make a choice about the naming tradition. And I made a choice about the naming tradition. I decided that for my particular piece, I was going to compress everything to surnames. And that was because in English, when we refer to people in professional positions, we use the last name always. In Russian, that's not actually the case. So in certain contexts, you might use first name and patronymic in certain positions, and then in other positions, you might use their rank and then their last name. So it can easily look sloppy in English. Might look like an inconsistency. And also, using first name and patronymic in a lot of the speech can make things quite lengthy. And then to change the name that you use inside exposition can be tricky. So again, I made a choice. And that doesn't necessarily mean that it was a mistake. It's not completely accurate to the way that Russians speak, but sometimes things have to be changed for your readership, and that's one of them. So I had to get over that because, again, I'm so open to possible criticism. Did I get something else wrong? But no, what happened was seeing that particular style, tweak this reader, perfectly fine. The other part, though, was that even though this particular reader acknowledged that it was very well researched, they just had to find something wrong with it because it seemed as though they didn't like the book, and that's fine. It seemed like it had too many mature themes for them. But then they said that it seemed that I was perpetuating the stereotype that all Russian men just want women for sex and objectify them. And I was so struck by that because I thought, that's a stereotype? I've never heard that specific stereotype for Russian individuals. I think what really happened is that the book had a lot of very grim sexual content. But that doesn't at all account for all the male characters. This person said in the review, that might be some men, but it's not all. It's like, yeah, and my book has many male characters in it who have many other interests and many other focuses. So I feel like they might have just been looking for something. But the way that the review ended, saying that Clark says that they were being careful, but I think that they could have been more respectful of my culture because she felt like having complex human characters was disrespectful. That's their opinion. And again, it was one of those places where I left my heart open because I very much want to be, well, it's two things. I am highly sensitive to the fact that a lot of writers are awful when it comes to cultural critique. And I will always, there's always going to be a possibility of making a mistake and having to correct something. That's part of the process. And I don't see why more writers don't have integrity with that. Except for the fact that, of course, there's shame involved. So I can see on one level that we just get defensive. But in this particular case, I just wish that, if someone had a cultural critique of my work, it would be legitimate. That's all. So bring it on if you find one. And that'll be a great conversation. Okay, so with that in mind, that was a long prelude to actually doing a little bit of reading from this book, which I'm so happy I have a copy of. And again, I am thinking to myself, even though that particular critique's not quite accurate, I might add a foreword I might just nudge another edition that has one little page that explains that change when it comes to naming traditions, just so it doesn't trip too many others. Although again, if anybody has read Russian work in translation, they should recognize that this is a common choice that some folks make. But anyway, so I'm going to read from the first chapter. But before I read the first chapter, I did start with a piece of the Gulag Archipelago, which is really important. Honestly, this is one of the most haunting paragraphs in literature, all literature for me, and it inspired this book. I think it's important. So if you haven't read, Solzhenitsyn is himself a very complex person because he moved through many different reactive political points of view, which means that unfortunately his name has been brought up in relation to certain popular speakers, self-help gurus. And as a result, I think sometimes people now align any mention of his work with the references that have been made to his work by a certain self-help guru. And that particular person does not fully represent Solzhenitsyn's output properly. It's worth reading Gulag Archipelago if you can, and take breaks if you need to because it's quite painful. But here's just the one key section. So in it, Solzhenitsyn, of course, is talking about his own experience being sort of dragged up and dragged into the. So while he is being processed, at one point, he observes, the manuscripts lay there like the burial mound of some interred human spirit, its conical top rearing higher than the interrogator's desk, almost blocking me from his view. And brotherly pity ached in me for the labor of that unknown person who had been arrested the previous night, these spoils from the search of his premises having been dumped that very morning on the parquet floor of the torture chamber, at the feet of that 13-foot Stalin. I sat there and I wondered, whose extraordinary life had they brought in for torment, for dismemberment, and then for burning? Oh, how many ideas and works had perished in that building, a whole lost culture? Oh, soot, soot, from the Lubyanka chimneys. And again, this is part of the reason that I also felt writing about this particular period would be a way of honoring so much work that we have lost. Again, truly, it's not just the people on the street who've lost their potential to spend their time alive, brief witnesses to the cosmos, doing creative work, building something, sharing in something. It's also people in the past in times like this whose life's work and was absolutely destroyed in a heartbeat. We have wasted so much human potential on cruelty and negligence. And that's also why this particular period really resonates with me, is there is so much that we have probably lost in the way of tremendous storytellers in that period who should have been able to tell their own stories of what happened and instead were just slaughtered. So getting emotional thinking about it, but sometimes one must grieve. You must grieve for all this right now if you are to say you lived. Paraphrasing Zine Hikmet. So this is now chapter 1 of Then Raise the Dead Man High, which follows Valentina. She is 18. She is a hard-working engineering student, but she's also, like maybe some of the teens you know or were, very much consumed by her own personal dramas, and that is that she loves her best friend, Arseny, but Arseny, of course, has somebody else in his life. So here she is just trying to focus on her work, get on with your life. Well, it doesn't entirely work out well for her, but it goes. 18 January 1929. Northern Ivanovo Oblast, Russian SFSR. Chapter 1. After the power switched off for the night, Valentina Volkova sat alone before Necromantic Altar 17, thinking. The great folklorist she had summoned that day would have argued that no thinking man was ever alone, for where there is thought, there is mankind's steadiest companion, narrative impulse. But Valentina knew better than that rambling old billy-goat the weight of her aloneness, and at least some of its latest causes. One came from the dusty windows of the luminarium in which she sat, at the heart of the Ivanova Institute for Physical, Industrial, Agricultural, and Incorporeal Engineering. The luminarium was a converted textile factory with yellow brick walls and heart pine flooring, and 34 workstations for interviews with the dead. The third floor's little panes of glass were too grimy for any real definition, but they bore a warm glow, indicating the progress of a bonfire in the courtyard below. From the memory of other purge nights, Valentina could invoke the rest of the scene: the wisps of ash flitting like birds' wings in updrafts of heat, the invigorating char off pages from subversive books, the startling, acrid stench of their bindings, and the staccato bursting of air pockets in the underlying wood, that definitive snap-crack of orderly destruction. Her dear friend Arseny would still be in that happy throng along with the new woman in his life, and they would be singing all the good young communist songs, and he would tell Valentina before class the next day about all the latest party news she had missed for not attending, and she would feel it too tomorrow, that regret, that sense of exclusion. But for now she knew she couldn't bring herself to go, not when going meant meeting Raisa just yet. When Arseny had first described Raisa, a fresh-faced nursing student from the medical institute an hour's walk away, the gentleness of her countryside demeanor, the understated poise of her feminine intellect, the obliging sweetness of her smile, Valentina had agreed that Raisa sounded like a magical creature indeed, and was perfect for him, and would surely make him happy in all his years to come. But there must have been something wrong with this reply, some species of envy or passive rebuke that Valentina had not intended to inflict, because there came into Arseny's eyes then an immediate and calculating sharpness, which the pace of their cram session did not give Valentina time to amend. For the rest of the term her oldest friend seemed to shelter the subject of Raisa from their conversations, while Valentina, in hopes of restoring herself as a good comrade, went out of her way to invoke Raisa's existence, to naturalize it in the framework of their friendship. A good night to you and Raisa. Have a lovely walk to town tomorrow when you go to see Raisa. I hope the exams go well for you and Raisa. Rarely, though, did Arseny answer Valentina's questions about Raisa's well-being in the passage of their time together, which meant he had to know. Oh, father's beard, he knew. But also, what was it exactly that he thought he knew? Even Valentina couldn't say what her real motives were with him after all their childhood years together, and there lay the crux of her aloneness before the necromantic altar. Since her 10th birthday, to the day in 1920, if history books could still be believed, death itself had yielded to man's pursuit of knowledge, but still there were silences, terrible silences, within her and between her and her comrades that Valentina could not so much as fathom how to break. And yet the great folklorist summoned at the close of her working day had not been wrong either, for the longer that Valentina sat in the darkness, the more she worked the spectacle of a few stray noises into full narrative incidents: rats stuffing the walls to prepare for coming litters, a cat along the window ledge crunching the bones of a bird trapped in the rafters, an errant whisper between floorboards, as if a spirit had only half returned to whatever netherworld it occupied between suns. Familiar sounds, workplace sounds, and yet when a notebook from one of the other stations fell to the luminarium's old factory floor, over an assortment of restored gaps and depressions from the building's first far heavier machines, Valentina reached with an anxious hand for her saucer of kerosene, which with great care could be used in place of the Institute's long decommissioned lamps. Hello? On its first and second sweeps of Valentina's surroundings, the saucer's wan flickers found no movement in the shadows. Then the buttons on a calico dress, adorned in the constructivist style with simple black and gray squares, glinted from the corridor between workstations. Valentina quickly recognized the round, white face of Comrade Rosalia Mikhailovna Delova. an industrial materials instructor. Verova's expression was severe but also curious, even surprised and preoccupied in a way that Valentina could not fully place. Ah, said Durovna, with a jut of her chin. So you're the last. I should have known. There's a watch out, you know. No one should be without a companion on the grounds. Yes, of course, I'm sorry. Valentina stood and smoothed the creases in her calf-high skirt. Only the work, which will go faster once the power returns. Belova glanced about them and pursed her lips tightly, unconvinced or impatient. For now, she added, it's time to rest. Nothing good can come of youth out idling in the dark. But for all the gravity in her tone, the instructor said this last with only a cough and beckoning hand, and waited while Valentina organized her materials around altar 17. There were 4 bundles of documents from the day's last summoning, a set of biographical statements about the folklorist in Kew, a summary of his known literary contributions ranked by their value to the present age, a series of interview questions pre-approved by the Institute and its party oversight committee, and a checklist to assess the century-old subject's answers for any subversive sentiment. This last bundle also held a set of troubling pencil marks by Valentina, which together suggested that the folklorist would be a prime candidate for elimination from the catalogue accessible to future scholars. Even now, in anticipatory obedience to the possibility of that state ban, Valentina could not bring herself to so much as think her subject's name. She wanted a good night's rest though before finalizing her conclusions about his politics, and so she surveyed her pile of working notes with some small satisfaction at the prospect of further distraction, before Comrade Durova again coughed and beckoned for them to go. That's not at all the whole chapter. To have Valentina very soon think, wait a second, why is my teacher out this late at night alone if everything is quite as tense as all that? And so will begin a little mystery that will carry her to an unfortunate close in the first section. But that gives you a little taste of the way that I wrote this piece. And hopefully you can hear in it the love with which I wrote this piece. But if not, there'll be another reading another day for the rest. Yes, I do have some talk I want to share for the Q&A. Great. So let us move on to some of the questions that folks asked all about this work, the good stuff, not always the negative feedback. Although again, I'm perfectly fine with negative feedback. I just wish it would, damn it, just one. So there were quite a few questions about this particular work, but what I wanted to talk about here was more how many of these questions often reflect more about other aspects of the writing world. So for instance, I had one reader who was so interested in the notion of the afterlife that I have in this work. And that makes perfect sense. I'm an atheist. Why am I writing about an afterlife? Well, not a spiritual afterlife. That is a key component here. And that's a question that a lot of the characters do ask because there are religious folk inside this text and they do wonder. And so for many of them, they see the afterlife in which these voices are dredged up from as a sort of holding area for the real afterlife. That's the way that they negotiate it. And that relates to something that has happened throughout history, is whenever there's a new scientific discovery, that realm of the supernatural is pushed back just a little bit further, just a little bit more. And it happened in the 19th century when we started to accumulate so much knowledge from a body of different disciplines that illustrated I'm being generous, no signs in the natural world of any kind of supernatural element. And so you would have many people who were of the cloth, people who were clergy in various Christian orders, who would say, well, that just lies, the supernatural part, the realm of God, divinity, the spiritual, it just lies beyond the veil of nature. So it's just one step removed. And so this book, especially starting in the 1920s, when you still have so much and excitement over Lenin's ideas, and dialectical materialism, the idea of reforming sciences in a much more secular way, rigidly secular and sometimes dogmatically secular, to the point that many interesting questions in science in that period were not considered to be acceptable within the Soviet Union. Quantum mechanics, uncertainty, not in this communist state. So very complicated, messy, fascinating period. And within that, I absolutely wanted to imagine a much more technical, secular, scientific afterlife in which these voices exist. And with them, a level of consciousness, which is what the characters discover over the course of the book, to terrible ends with respect to how the state uses them. The other interesting component that came out of that body of questions was, why the Soviet Union? Oh my goodness, it'd be so much more interesting to set this in the United States. I want to see how Christians handle this. I want to see how, these dominant faiths, why set it in an atheist space when you can look at how it would affect people in religious spheres in North America, and North Americans could do so much more with it. Part of it is our Western bias. We do have problems with stories that are set in other places. We always want to bring it back to ourselves. But there's also a kind of, again, meanness that can come out of trying to set it somewhere closer to home when we ourselves are very much within certain subject positions in that space. So would I be truly able to do justice to how bodies of different Christian movements in the United States and Canada, for instance, would have responded to this work? Or would I have built caricatures without meaning to, simply because it is my context and I move within it? Whereas this other context, taking as the baseline a very secular world in many ways, I need to be cautious about that. A lot of folks like to talk about Stalinist Russia as if it was without religion. It was not. And I want to be very clear, the best way of putting it is more like it's religion without the Christian God. But Stalin, and the way that his portrait and the iconography of Stalin definitely built along the same kind of structures and apparatuses that people had been using for icons of faith before then. So you have a very strong religiosity just outside of Christian faith to a large extent. And unfortunately, the characters of faith in this book are cruelly treated, which is exactly what happened in the time period. It's not a kind period. So again, it's interesting. I know a lot of readers always want something that's more comfortable, something that's more self-congratulatory. Oh, let's put this in the United States and make fun of religious folk with it. And it's just, is it useful? Does it help? Or is it just self-serving? This is a huge test to place humanism in a secular community that is so filled with state cruelty, and then to see if it can still thrive. That was the test I set for myself with this book. And there were also, of course, other folks who were curious about how much of me was in this piece. And it's a fun question. I should just say one other thing about the other component. The one thing I find charming about folks who want to reimagine a story in another context is, great, my work has done its work. It's created a world that a person now wants to live in. And often I find that folks with that kind of response, they're itching to write work of their own, which is great. So if it inspires that, go forth, write your own stories and build on the parts that you like and throw away the rest. So all of that's good. With respect to personal connections to the work, there are some. I will not tell you what they all are at all, but I will say a few things. One person was speculating that some of the scenes in this book might have been inspired by my own experiences with violence in Colombia, and I will tell you, no. There are no scenes in this book that are inspired by my time in Colombia. There are scenes in this book that are inspired by life in Canada. Shocking, I know, but cruelty can exist in a lot of ways and places. And the way that we can be cruel to one another, and the ways that we can be self-deluded about our cruelty to one another, can emerge in many forms. So I will say that one cannot help but write with a piece of themselves in it. But it's also fascinating how much people want to graft, are you this character, are you that character? If I were to to describe myself in relation to these characters, I would say there's a bit of me in all of these characters. And that includes Arseny, who's in the NKVD, and not a kind person, and definitely a person who's been trying to put his sense of guilt on somebody else or multiple people because he doesn't know how to live with the way that he's traumatized himself in the process of doing unconscionable things to other people. Complicated book. Yeah, so those are some fun questions. And it was good to have a range in terms of settings as well for this piece. The first section being set in a school environment really allowed me to spell out and explore a lot of the actual state ideology and the grand ideas that emerged in the earlier part of the communist era, whereas the second part being set in the purge, you get to see just the paranoia and the distress and the pain and the suffering and the loss and the prejudice, so much prejudice, and the ethnically motivated violence, quite cruel. And the third being set in Gulag, I wanted to do something a little bit different there too, which is definitely also why it was important for me to have female characters. And it's funny, I've also gotten this response is that a lot of people misread the third section, and I think it's because we have such a bias in our culture towards thinking that, you know, women are automatically better, or they'll band together, or they'll group together and they'll do it. You know, there's a really odd, dehumanizing way in which we treat stories involving multiple feminized characters. But the Gulag section has women who are often quite cruel to one another, in part because they themselves are still working through their own trauma. And again, hurt people hurt people. So I truly aimed to write characters who were complex and going through their trauma in complex ways. For instance, one thing with the last character, Rock, she's eventually going to do something that she knows is probably going to take her life. And so she decides near the end, you know what, I'm going to give this one prisoner who's been flirting with me the time in his life before I go, but she's going into this cynically, and she's truly thinking to herself, and it's going to affirm for me, you know, people are all just awful and cruel. And actually, he's kind of a nice fellow, and it upsets her because it's not what she expected, because she has been hurt so many times that this one act of kindness actually is also quite traumatic because it's destabilizing her worldview, and she needs it to be set because she's about to do something dramatic. She's about to do something that might save the world, and she's going to die in the process, but who cares? The world's an awful place anyway. So I truly aim to explore the way that trauma works on us in a variety of contexts. And that might not always come across clearly, of course not, but I am very thankful for the number of people who decided to follow along and to give it a shot. And if it's not for you, it's not for you. Please know that's okay. I'm looking forward to other work I publish this year, perhaps being for you instead. For now, I think that's pretty much it. There are probably, oh gosh, I think I missed one Q&A question, but we're coming up to almost 50 minutes. So let's call it a day here, and I'll get back to the rest of those questions next time when I talk a little bit more about the actual campaigns, the promo, the indie publishing side of things, how that's worked out. But thank you so very much to everyone who's made this possible and has been patient with me as I myself am trying to move through the difficult integrity of being a person first and trying to be a humanist above all else while pursuing making it as much as one can within a very complex literary scene. Thank you so very much, and have yourself a wonderful day or evening, wherever it finds you.